Testing. All right, looks like some people are showing up. We have a few people who are trying to connect through the YouTube stream. Everyone is getting their stuff set up. Just give me a second to adjust a few things. Hopefully you can all see the slide now for our presentation tonight. Feel free to talk. You don't have to stay on mute. Oh, almost gave away where we're going. I'll give you a hint. It's out of Egypt. Stop doing that. Everyone is welcome to follow along with the screen. Ah, hello.
Hi, it's me.
Hey, Jeannie. How you doing?
I'm doing very well, Rabbi. Thanks for asking, but I'm not going to have visual today.
Ah, understood. Hopefully you can all see the screen that I've shared that has our first slide. If you want, I also made the file available through a Dropbox link, and you can download it as a PDF.
Okay. I am going to mute because of my animals.
Thank you for considering the rest of us. But feel free to unmute if you have a question or comment.
Thank you, Rabbi.
And that goes for everyone as well. Feel free to mute or unmute as you need. But this is meant to be participatory. So if you have questions or comments, just chime right in.
Aid? I need my earphones. Do you know where my purse is?
Jeannie, I think you do still have us unmuted.
Unmuted. Yes, I do. Sorry.
That's okay. Looks like more people are getting linked in.
Rabbi.
Yes, Mar.
Yeah, I guess Jose and Gina might have some issues because they're not that computer savvy.
Right.
I send them the link for YouTube. Is that okay?
Of course. They can always watch on YouTube. It just means they can't interact as much.
Okay.
Hey, Robertson, how are you doing?
I'm good. How about yourself, Rabbi?
Doing all right.
Yeah. We can see him.
Yep.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's one of the things I like about Zoom is we actually get to see other human beings, which as much as I love my family, it's nice to see other human beings.
Testing. Yeah, sure.
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear. Who was that though? Was that you, John?
Yes.
Great. So we'll give it a few more minutes before we get going because I imagine that people might be having some technical difficulties. Hopefully, once we get this first session going, people will be more familiar with it by the time we roll around for other classes in the future. And it's, of course, our deepest prayer and wish that we won't have to do too many like this at all. but we can never predict.
Let's hope. Yeah.
You taking us for a drive, Robertson?
I'm too noisy, so I needed a little bit more quiet. I'm gonna sit in the car in the AC instead.
All right. Well, we've given ourselves a 5-minute cushion. This is being recorded for YouTube, so anybody that's a little late can always review the beginning part of the session. But I do have another meeting at 7, so without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started. So it may be a little strange to be talking about the topic of Pesach, of liberation, but here we are, just 3 weeks away from the holiday. And if we don't talk about it now, we won't have time to talk about it before we have to do something about it. So even though people may feel a little captive in their homes or under great pressure, let's try and focus on the theme of freedom, the theme of being liberated, and the joy that can come from that. So we're going to go through Pesach in 2 different classes. This is the first class, which is going to deal about why we celebrate Pesach in its most basic sense, but also how we celebrate Pesach in our homes through the Seder. The next class will deal more with chametz and other topics of Pesach, chametz being the leavening that we have to remove from our homes. So let's go ahead and get going. There we go. Gonna have to minimize that. There we are. So the first question we have, of course, is why Pesach? Why are we celebrating Passover? And the answer for that, of course, comes very conveniently in the Torah itself, in Exodus 12. Speak to the whole community, and my camera's in the way. Speak to the whole community of Israel and say that on the 10th of this month, each of them shall take a lamb to a family, a lamb to a household. You shall keep watch over it until the 14th day of this month, and all the assembled congregation of the Israelites shall slaughter it at twilight. They shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they are to eat it. They shall eat the flesh that same night. They shall eat it roasted over the fire, with unleavened bread and with bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or cooked in any way with water, but roast it, head, legs, and entrails over the fire. You shall not leave any of it over until morning. If any of it is left over until morning, you shall burn it. So before we get to the highlighted underlined part, let's make sure we understand what's going on here. This is while we are still slaves in Egypt, while we are awaiting the final plague, the 10th plague that is going to come at that night, God is giving a command that all of the people of Israel should take a lamb, should slaughter it, should mark their homes as being the homes of Israelites, Jewish homes, and within their homes they should have this shared lamb that will be the beginning of their leaving of the land of Egypt. They're going to celebrate their freedom before they are actually free. And in addition to the lamb itself, they are going to eat unleavened bread, what we call matzah, and they are going to eat bitter herbs, something that is maror. So we will talk about both of those in more detail. But it explains, this is how you shall eat it, your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. And you shall eat it hurriedly. It is a Passover offering to the Lord. So why the style of eating here, with our cloaks tied in a way that lets us travel, with our sandals ready to go on our feet, with the staff ready to go on our hand? It is because even though we were still slaves, even though we were still waiting for liberation, we had to eat as though we were about to be free. This is an act of faith on our part. This is showing that even though all the rest of the miracles of the Exodus had been done for us by God through the instrument of Moses, we were willing to at least do our part to show that we believed this night we would be free, and that we were going to eat in such a manner that it was as though we anticipated the call to leave at any second, and we did not want to be even a minute late having to find our shoes, find our staff, or anything else. Any questions on that? Make sense? Okay, then we move on. So furthermore, to understand why we are doing Pesach the way we do, we are reminded, again, this is now in Exodus 13, that 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, matzah, and on the seventh day there shall be a festival of the Lord. That is the end of Pesach, where we also have a special service in the synagogue. Oh, just a second, we've got a chat over here. We just invite them into the Zoom if they can. Okay. And this is reminding us that throughout the 7 days, unleavened bread shall be eaten. No leavened bread shall be found within you, and no leaven shall be found in all your territory. Again, we'll talk about these requirements, these commandments in our session next week in much more detail. And you shall explain to your son on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I went free from Egypt. And this shall serve as a sign on your hand and as a reminder on your forehead, in order that the teaching of the Lord may be in your mouth, that with a mighty hand the Lord freed you from Egypt. You shall keep this institution at its set time from year to year. So at its most basic level, the reason why we are celebrating Pesach is because we are commanded to reenact and remember the exodus that came about in Egypt at the same time that it came about to Egypt, from Egypt each year. This remembrance, this symbolic reenactment, is to remind us that we went out of Egypt. Now, for the first generation that was being addressed here, they, of course, were the generation that went out from Egypt. However, every subsequent generation, the children that are being taught this, and the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren, they were not from Egypt. They had been born either in the wilderness of Sinai or in the land of Israel itself. And yet there is this requirement that as we explain the idea of Passover, of the holiday, that it will be because we went free. It is that personalization, that connection to the liberation that has to be felt in every single generation by every single person, no matter how distant we are from the land of Egypt. And to understand that the reason we went free is because of God's great power to try and liberate us. And of course, that is indicative then of one of God's goals for all of humanity, is that God wants people to be free. Questions or comments? Moving on. Whoop. The mouse is on the wrong thing. There we go. And get the chat back up. Sorry, still trying to learn how to juggle all of the different buttons. So that means with Pesach, we have a number of different mitzvot, a number of different commandments that we work with. The first commandment, as we saw from our first text, is the Korban Pesach, the Passover sacrifice. Now, we can't do that. The Passover sacrifice is only offered in the altar in Jerusalem at the temple. Prior to that, of course, it was offered in the tabernacle. But since we have neither, we do not engage in the Passover sacrifice of these days. So that means we only really have 3 mitzvot that are our primary focus. The first, of course, is the eating of the Passover ritual meal, the Seder. But not only the eating, but the ritual that surrounds the meal. And that's what we're going to focus most of our time on tonight. And then the eating of the matzah, as we saw as well from our first text, were separate mitzvot, separate commandments in and of themselves that went along with that first Seder. And we'll talk about those in some detail tonight. And then getting rid of the chametz, getting rid of the leavening from our homes and from our property is a much more involved discussion. And I'm going to save that for next time. So let's go ahead and dive in. Whoop, it is still on the wrong thing. Okay, let's go ahead and dive in. How did I get that to do that before? Just a second. We're going to go ahead and dive in to how we take care of these things. Now, at the centerpiece of the Seder, of that ritualized meal, is a book called the Haggadah. The Haggadah literally means a telling, a retelling, the sharing of the story. And this is your Seder guidebook. The word Seder itself means an order. And the Seder, as a ritualized meal, as a formal gathering, was established to help us fulfill all the mitzvot of Passover in the most perfect way possible. And there was a clear structure, but also room and need for personal additions. This is very, very important. I have been to, unfortunately, some Sidarim, some Seders, where people read the Haggadah as though it was a script. The Haggadah is not a script to be recited. It is the framework to make sure we do not look over anything essential. So it's not simply enough to read every word of every page of the Haggadah. If you do that and nothing else, you have not fulfilled the mitzvah of having the retelling of the Seder and the experience of the Seder. There always needs to be personal additions. And I'm going to point out as we go along some of the different places and ways that those personal additions are most likely to crop up and that you can focus on for yourself. Moving on. So the Haggadah itself is broken into a number of different parts, literally in order that we can follow the steps and make sure nothing is left out. We begin with Kadesh, the ritual recital of the Kiddush, the blessing over the wine, and of course the drinking of the first cup of wine. There are going to be 4 cups total, and I'll explain why in a minute. Then we move to Orchatz. This is a non-ritual washing of the hands. This is actually a hygienic washing of the hands. We'll get to the ritual washing a little bit later, but Orchatz is our attempt to wash our hands because most people would be coming in from a day of work, whether that be laboring in the field or whether that be working in some other way. And when they reach this point and they're beginning their dinner, you want to get rid of the schmutz, the mud and dirt that are on your hands. We then move to karpas, which might be considered an appetizer. This is the dipping of the karpas, usually a green, but it could be any food over which we say borei pari ha'adamah, fruit of the earth, and it is dipped into salt water and then eaten. We're going to go through these in more detail as we go on. I just want to give you the general structure. This is followed up by Yachatz, which is the breaking of the middle matzah, and the larger piece from the middle matzah of 3, it becomes the afikomen. Again, all will be explained. The Magid is the largest section of the service. The Magid is when we retell the Passover story, and this involves eventually at the end the drinking of a second cup of wine. Excuse me. Headphones are a little pinchy. Let's try that. All right. Then we move on to the actual preparation for the meal and the final symbolic eating that begins it. Starting with rachsa, which is the second washing of the hands, and then followed by motzi matzah, which is the blessing before we eat the matzah, and then maror, the blessing that we say before we eat the maror, the bitter herbs. And then we get to korech, which is the eating of a type of sandwich, of bits of matzah put together with the matzah and maror in the middle. Following this, we get the part that everybody loves, the shulchan orech. This is the actual eating of the meal. And then, unfortunately, a lot of people at this point stop. But there are still many more parts of the Seder to be enjoyed. Most importantly, of course, is safun. This is the eating of the afikomen, that part that we saved from the middle matzah earlier on. And then there is barech, which is the birkat hamazon, the blessing after the meal, over which we drink the third cup of wine. And there is Hallel, which is the recitation of Hallel, together with many other songs, and the drinking of the fourth cup of wine, and then Nirtzah, the final conclusion of the Seder. All of this can take many variable amounts of time. You could, if you were very quick and keeping it to a minimum, do the entire Seder in a very short period of time. 40 minutes, no problem, not counting time for the food. On the other hand, you can also have a Seder that goes on into the wee hours of the morning. Not the meal part, that needs to be done earlier on, but everything from the second part of the Seder onward can be done until very early in the morning indeed, depending upon the enthusiasm of your participants. So does everyone now have at least a basic understanding of the overall structure of the Seder?
Yes.
All right. Don't hear any objections. I hear one yes. That's good. I know it's hard with the mute and all of that, but do feel free to pipe up And you can also, actually, I'm not sure. Did I close the chat? I don't know whether or not I can make sure that if I've got any, okay, yeah, there is a chat box for the Zoom group as well. If you need to share anything, just pipe in. So let's take these each in their own turn. Like all holidays, we sanctify the day with Kiddush. This prayer emphasizes the joy of the holidays and the special theme of the particular day. So there's always a section that just says, in general, holidays are great, but then there's also a particular reminder of why this holiday is great. And in this particular case, we are recognizing Passover as the time of our liberation. Unique to Passover, on the other hand, we drink 4 cups of wine throughout the evening rather than just the one. That is to say, there are 4 ritualized cups. Usually there is just 1, maybe 2, depending upon how you do Birkat Hamazon, but definitely not 4. Now, these need not be large, very important, and they can be watered down or even filled with kosher for Passover grape juice as necessary. Unfortunately, some people drink large wine goblets for each of the 4 cups, and this can be rather debilitating by the time you get to the end of the Seder. The Talmud even talks about people who are nodding off, and it's better to make sure that you can stay awake and drink a modest amount that you know you can handle. Now, why 4 cups? Well, if we go back to Exodus 6, when God is giving to Moses his instructions, God makes a series of 4 promises. Say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from slavery to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who has brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. As you can see, if you look at the 4 different things that I've highlighted there, there are 4 separate promises of action from God to the Israelites, to the Jewish people. And since all 4 of those were fulfilled as God liberated us during the Egyptian Exodus, we raise a cup, if you will, in honor of each of those 4 promises that were fulfilled. So if anyone ever asks you why we have 4 cups, you can point them to Exodus 6. Onward. Urchatz and Karpas, very straightforward. We wash our hands, as I mentioned. This is for hygiene. We do not say a blessing over this. This is just good practice, something that I think we've all become more acutely aware of during this epidemic season, that washing your hands regularly is probably good for your health. Thankfully, we have even better ways to wash than they did. At this time, we also say Berei Pri Ha'adama, and eat an earth vegetable that is dipped in salt water. Most commonly in this part of the world is the choice of parsley. There were some places where potato was often common, but the idea is to do this at this point, both as an appetizer to build up our enthusiasm for the meal, this being a holdover from the days when we would also be eating from the sacrifice, and one wanted to make sure that one had a good appetite for the sacrifice. It is also said that the dipping in the salt water is symbolic of the sweat and tears of us when we were slaves. And the green, of course, is a sign of spring, that at this point in the agricultural cycle around the world, as spring is happening, all of a sudden the world is waking up and there's something to eat again. And so having a symbol of that is always also very welcome. Now, Yachatz is the breaking of that middle matzah. And as I mentioned before, half of it is set aside later as the afikomen. Now, the middle matzah is very common among the Ashkenazim world. Right? The idea of breaking a matzah goes all the way back to the Talmud, but the idea of having 3 matzot, 3 sheets of matzah, is really something that caught on more in the Ashkenazic world. Because, as you may or may not know from either other holidays or most certainly from Shabbat, we usually have 2 loaves of challah on a regular holiday or Shabbat. This is to remind us of the double portion of manna that God gave to us when we were in the wilderness, and having the 2 loaves gives us that visual. So it's normal to have 2, and then we would break one and reduce it, meaning that now we can say literally, this is lechem oni. This is an impoverished bread. This is a bread of affliction, a term you'll often hear used to refer to matzah that's taken from the Haggadah and our text, because it has been reduced. And this is certainly a very powerful way to make us feel closer to those who are in want. And indeed, we always invite those who are in need to our Seder, which is one of the things that's going to be very hard this coming year, when most of us are unfortunately still likely to be in a position where we cannot commingle with too many. We will have to find other ways to support those that are in need. However, as powerful as that imagery was of going from 2 full matzahs to 1.5 matzahs, it made the meal seem, well, impoverished. And so there were many commentators who advocated, and this became the tradition, of having 2 full matzahs and the 3rd matzah, and then breaking that extra one, in this case the middle one, in order to give us 2 full loaves, but also have the broken one as the reminder. And if I haven't confused you completely, we'll move on. We move on to the most important and the lengthiest section of the service, the Magid, excuse me. So what does it say in Pesachim, in the Mishnah? They pour him a 2nd cup, and here the child asks the parent, and according to the child's understanding, the parent teaches, beginning with shame and concluding with praise, interpreting from Arami Oved Avi, my father was a wandering Aramean, until he finishes the entire passage. So this section, of the Magid is reminding us that the Seder is, as we saw in our second text that we looked at this evening, is designed not only for me to reenact and experience the Exodus, but also for me to pass on that experience to my children and them to their children and so on. And so it begins with a text that is taken from the rites in the Torah of when a person would bring the offering of their first fruits to the temple, which talks about how we started off in a very bad position, and that eventually God brought us out of Egypt. And that is a short paragraph that we then use as the framework, the skeleton, to expand our teachings around. In the process, we also declare, this is the bread of affliction that our fathers ate in the land of Egypt. Whoever is hungry, let him come and eat. Whoever is in need, let him come and conduct the Seder of Passover. This year we are here, next year in the land of Israel. This year we are slaves, next year we will be free people. There is a lot going on here. First of all, as I mentioned, the invitation to those who hunger, that they are always welcome at our table. Secondly, I've often been asked that, what do you do if you are in Israel? Because after all, we say this year we are here, next year in the land of Israel. And what we say is exactly the same. I've had the privilege to celebrate the Seder twice in Israel, and you say the same line if you're in Israel, because we hope that we will be able to celebrate Pesach in Israel every year thereafter. The final line is, of course, the most emotionally powerful. This year we are slaves, next year we will be free people. Most of us, thank God, are not currently slaves. However, for the purposes of retelling this story, we have to empathize and feel as though we are slaves, so that our liberation will feel more emotionally powerful and personal to us. Liberation is not something that just happened to people many, many years ago. Liberation and freedom and emancipation is something that we are all currently experiencing and benefiting from. But we have to put ourselves into that situation in order to feel it as we go through the rest of the Seder. All right, I feel like I'm racing you guys through this, but I'm not hearing any questions or seeing any comments, so I think we will move on. The 4 questions is often considered to be one of the highlights of a Seder. It is often a section of the Haggadah that is reserved for the youngest capable child at the table, and it is a set of prompts to make the child ask questions. Now, what you'll notice, of course, is that there is really only one question. Why is this night different than all other nights? And then there are 4 examples of differences. However, each one of those is usually colloquially referred to as a question. In our current Haggadah, the 4 questions read as follows. On all other nights, we eat chametz and matzah, that is to say, the leavened fluffy bread and flat bread. But on this night, we eat only matzah. On all other nights, we eat many vegetables. On this night, maror. We eat the bitter vegetables in particular. You can have other vegetables as well, but deliberately putting bitter herbs on the plate was rather unusual. On all other nights, we do not dip vegetables even once. On this night, we dip twice. The first dipping was the dipping into the salt water of karpas. The second dipping is going to happen when we have the maror, the bitter herbs. On all other nights, we eat sitting. Some eat sitting and others reclining. On this night, we are all reclining. So the tradition is to eat in a recumbent posture. Nowadays, we usually lean in our chair. In the ancient world, people would actually have more like a Roman couch to recline upon. Someday, I'd like to get enough of those to do a Seder, but that's not for this year, perhaps. Now, why have these questions here? Why have these observations? Well, first of all, what it is doing is telling our children to notice that things are different, and the differences were done in order that you would ask questions, right? In order to ask questions, you have to know what is regular so that you can notice what is out of place. And you have to know that you have permission to ask questions. One of the most important things in Judaism is giving permission not only to our children, but to adults and any who come to ask questions of why we are doing this, because Judaism does these things for a reason. It is not mere accident or tradition that we do any of our rituals the way we do. It is precisely so it will jar us out of our normalcy into a different state of being and perception of the world. And so if you notice something different, ask. It is 9 times out of 10 done very deliberately, and the 10th time, it may have escaped the notice of the person doing it, and then you can find out together. And how do we know that it is meant precisely to jog the memory of those people that are there? Well, because these 4 questions are not the original 4 questions. If you look in the Talmud, it gives us a very different discussion. First, an introduction, which is very familiar. And here the son asks his father, but if the son has not got the intelligence to do so, the father tells him, how different is this night from all other nights? Again, we see that it is not just the child has to ask, but it is the parent who has to try and elicit the questions from the child and even prompt them so that they get used to asking these questions. And the questions are, for on all of the nights we eat chametz and matzah, but on this night all of the bread is matzah, familiar. For on all of the nights we eat diverse vegetables, but on this night only bitter herbs, again very familiar. For on all other nights we eat meat, which is roasted, stewed, or boiled, but this night all of the meat is roasted. Wait a minute. That was not in our previous set of 4 questions. If we go back, our number 3 was talking about dipping. And furthermore, we get to number 4, we get something similar to our last number 3. For on all of the nights we dip our food 1 time, but on this night we dip twice. But back here we talked about not dipping at all and now dipping twice. And we didn't mention reclining at all. Why is this? Well, because this is what the Seder looked like if you lived in the 1st century of the Common Era. If the temple was still standing and you were still offering a sacrifice, then you would be eating the roasted lamb from the temple sacrifice. And in their culture, they dipped at every meal. That was just how you ate. And still to this day, in most Middle Eastern cuisine, there is an awful lot of dipping. Pita is a remarkably good dipper, but dipping is very, very popular. But there was a special additional dipping on Pesach, and that would have been noticed by the children of their generation. So the questions are to match what the children and the people are experiencing, which is why it finishes by saying, in accord with the intelligence of the son, the father instructs him. You have to answer according to the child. You cannot simply memorize the answer to all of these questions. You have to adapt and continue to explain it as best matches the person who is asking the question. So if a child asks, you'll answer one way. If a teenager asks, you'll answer a different way. If an adult asks, you'll answer a different way. If a scholar asks, you will discuss it and answer it in a different way altogether. But that is meant to be the process going forward. Any questions? He asked. Because if not, we can notice that in the Yerushalmi, which is the Jerusalem Talmud, there are only 3 questions. Again, why do we dip not even once, but tonight we dip twice, because they had a different custom of dipping. On all of the nights we eat chametz and matzah, tonight only matzah. And all of the nights we eat meat that is roasted, boiled, or cooked, but tonight only roasted. Again, they are reflecting the experiences that they had, which were different than the experiences of the Jews in other communities, and certainly in other times. We continue with the Magid section, this telling of the story. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord our God took us out from there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. If the Holy One, blessed be he, had not taken our fathers out of Egypt, then we, our children, and our children's children would have remained enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt. Even if all of us were wise, all of us of understanding, all of us knowing the Torah, we would still be obligated to discuss the Exodus from Egypt. And everyone who discusses the Exodus from Egypt at length is praiseworthy. The Haggadah is telling us that this is not merely an educational activity. This is not something you keep repeating until you learn it. This is something you keep repeating when you've learned it, so that you will continue to experience it. So you will continue to have the emotional connection. One of the reasons why the whole Seder was linked with food and drink and flavors of different varieties and different sitting postures and everything is to give us different ways to experience it bodily, so that we are reenacting this to the deepest part of ourselves. And you never get too old for that, and you never get too wise for that. Indeed, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, I am like a 70-year-old man, and I have not succeeded in understanding. There's a long discussion at this point in the formal Haggadah that goes into how much a person who's even this old and even this wise can still learn from the sharing of the Haggadah experience. Blessed be the God who has given the Torah to his people. Blessed be he. The Torah speaks of 4 sons, a wise one, a wicked one, a simple one, and one who is not able to ask a question. The 4 sons, mimicking the 4 questions, mimicking 4 cups. You'll notice the 4 continues throughout much of the Haggadah, is a way to show us again that there are different ways to answer the same question or similar questions from different people. How do we know that the Torah talks about 4 children? Well, because there are 4 different quotes throughout the Torah, which gives us the advice of how to answer our children. And it will come to pass when your children will say to you, what is the meaning of this service to you? And you shall say, it is a Passover offering to God, taken from Exodus 12. In Exodus 13, on the other hand, it says, and you shall tell your son on that day, it is because of this that the Lord did for me when I left Egypt. Notice in that particular passage, there is no statement of a question. This is the example of a person answering the question that the child cannot ask for himself. Number 3, and it shall be when your son asks you on the morrow, saying, what is this? And you shall say to him, with a strong hand, the Lord took us out of Egypt, also from Exodus 13. And then finally in Deuteronomy, when your son asks you on the morrow, saying, what are the testimonies, the statutes, and the laws that the Lord our God has commanded you? And you shall say to your son, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and God took us out of Egypt with an outstretched arm. What is unusual is when, what is unusual is when this 4-son motif appears in the Haggadah, the answers that are given are all mixed up. Meaning we get the question that are similar to the questions here. What is the meaning of this service to you? What is this? No question at all. And what are the testimony, statutes, and laws? All 4 of those come in the mouths of different children, but the answers do not exactly match up to the answers that are given here in this section. Why? Because the Haggadah is trying to tell us, who they think know all of these quotes by heart, that just because you hear the same question doesn't mean you give the same answer. You have to hear what is behind the question. You have to hear the person asking the question, not merely the words on the surface. Any questions so far? All right, we're going to actually skip over the next part, I am afraid, because we are running low on time. But I'll leave this up here just for a second on the video. You can pause it if you like. This next section is the verse by verse, phrase by phrase analysis of that special declaration that I mentioned came when people would bring their offerings for the first fruit. And what the Haggadah is doing is showing you that each word or each phrase can be expounded upon, can be added to as we try to interpret and express our wonder at what happened during the Exodus. So this is just giving us an example. Again, we should be telling this in our own way as well and adding to this in our own way with our own question and our own answers, our own reflections, because everyone brings something worthwhile to the Seder, and that needs to be added around all of this. But this template is a great place to start. As you can see, it really tries to expand on all the different parts of the Seder, of that declaration. Which then brings us, as we talk about the amazing things that God did for us, to the 10 plagues. This is something that many people have a different set of opinions on. It seems almost a bit of a schadenfreude, the German term for rejoicing at someone else's misfortune. But this section of the 10 plagues is not meant to rejoice at someone else's downfall, but to celebrate the fact that God was willing and able to do these things to pry us free from the Egyptian slavery. And so the 10 are laid out here. It is the custom in most communities to reduce one's cup of this second cup of wine 10 times as a way of showing that we would rather that we had been able to be liberated without the strife and trouble that the plagues caused to even our enemies. But since it did require this, we nonetheless are glad that God was willing and able to bring us our deliverance. Indeed, Rabbi Yossi the Galilean says, how does one derive that after the 10 plagues in Egypt, the Egyptians suffered 50 plagues at the sea? Well, concerning the plagues in Egypt, the Torah states that the magician said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. However, at the sea, the Torah relates that Israel saw the great hand which the Lord had laid upon the Egyptians. If one finger equals 10, 5 fingers equals 50. This begins a section in the Haggadah where the rabbis will use similar wordplay to try and show many more multiples of how much more and greater were God's gifts to us even after the 10 plagues in delivering us the rest of the way out of Egypt. Which leads us to what is a very favorite part for many people because it's got a great melody, Dayenu. God has bestowed many favors upon us. Had he brought us out of Egypt and not executed judgments against the Egyptians, it would have been enough, Dayenu. Had he executed judgments against the Egyptians and not their gods, it would have been enough, Dayenu. Had he executed judgments against their gods and not put to death their firstborn, it would have been enough, Dayenu. And on it goes. So therefore, how much more so then should we be grateful to God for the numerous favors that he has bestowed upon us? This Dayenu is not saying it would have been enough, meaning enough to get us free, but it would have been enough for us to have inaugurated a holiday to celebrate what God had done of moving the world closer to freedom and liberation. This notion of Dayenu is another retelling of the story. You may notice we've had a few now. We had the retelling through the 4 questions. We had the retelling through the 4 sons. We've had the retelling through the structure of my father was a wandering Aramean. And now we have a retelling through the Dayenu portion. There are multiple ways to tell this story of the Exodus, and it is up to each to experience and tell them as they need to. But eventually we have to get down to the crux of the matter. Rabban Gamliel used to say, anyone who has not discussed these 3 things on Passover has not fulfilled his duty, namely Pesach, the Passover offering, matzah, the unleavened bread, and maror, the bitter herbs. You may remember way back at the beginning, I mentioned that since the loss of the Passover sacrifice, these 3 remain the 3 mitzvot that are most central to this Passover night. In every generation, it is man's duty to regard himself as though he had personally come out of Egypt. As it is written, you shall tell your son on that day, this is on account of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. it was not only our fathers whom the Holy One redeemed from slavery, we too were redeemed with them. As it is written, he took us out of there so that he, might take us to the land which he had sworn to our fathers. We then read the first two Psalms of Hallel, Psalms 113, 114, and we have our second cup of wine, which leads us into the multimedia eating experience that is the prelude to our dinner. So we do now rachza, the washing of the hands. This is our usual netilat yadayim with the blessing. And this is the blessing we do whenever we are about to eat bread, because remember that matzah is a type of bread. It's just a very unleavened type of bread. Now, the fact that we are doing this washing, even though we already did a hygienic washing earlier at the beginning of our Seder, is a reminder that this washing has nothing to do with hygiene. We should wash our hands and make sure they are clean in a sanitary way at the beginning. This washing has to do with a ritual purity, most importantly in the ancient world, because when we are about to eat from the sacrifice, we need to make sure that we are ritually pure. But even in the modern world, we try to make sure that when we are about to eat a meal that is has bread, that is a substantial meal, that we are also in a state of ritual purity, or as close as we can get in the modern world. Having done that, we then keep our focus until we say the motzi itself. We eat the matzah first plain by itself, after saying both the motzi and a special blessing for matzah, which ends with the phrase al achilat matzah. Everyone still with me? I know I'm running because I'm afraid I'm looking at the clock, but I do want to make sure there is time for some questions. All right. If you've liked your matzah, whoop, hello. What happened there? Okay, well, I'm not sure if I lost a page there because I didn't quite memorize it, but we do also say a blessing before eating maror, before eating the bitter herbs. Ah, yes, I know what we lost. Ah, that's annoying. Oh, it came back. There we are. Okay, so pardon my computer, but we eat the bitter herbs, but we eat them after we have dipped them into what is called haroset. Haroset is a special mixture. The most common ingredients in the Ashkenazic world in the United States now is apples mixed with a bit of wine, usually a bit of walnuts or other types of nuts. Some people will add other things in there as well. I am very partial to adding in cinnamon as well as dates and other types of binding agents. And that is very sweet. It also looks like the mud that was used to make the bricks, and it is meant as an antidote to the bitterness that we are putting in. Now, what is maror? What are our bitter herbs? Well, this is where there is a lot of controversy and not. Meaning to say that from Pesachim too, we can see here from the Mishnah that these are the yirakot, the plants with which a person fulfills his obligation on Pesach. And you see a list there of many different plants, which, as I'll point out, the translations are slightly unclear. And one fulfills the obligation whether they are moist or dry, but not if they are pickled or stewed or boiled. They may be combined to make up an olive size, meaning you should eat at least an olive's worth of the bitterness of the bitter herb. If you look at the chart at the bottom, these are some of the best scholars' interpretations of what these five different types of plants might be. But one thing you will notice is not on the list, and that is horseradish. The bitter herb is definitely meant to be an herb, a plant. Nowadays, I find that usually endives or a particularly sharp dandelion, or sometimes you can get arugula, is the best you're going to get. We have done a really good job of making sure our modern plants are not bitter, and it's hard to find something bitter at the grocery store. But bitterness is very different than horseradish, because horseradish is not bitter, it is spicy, it is charif. And those are two different types of flavors. So do try to find something that is a bitter plant. Do not settle for just horseradish. It's fine to have horseradish at Pesach, save it for the gefilte fish. For this, make sure it is a nice leafy kind of plant that you are getting your sharp, bitter taste from. Okay, I'm going to leave this up here for just a second. The idea here is that it goes into more detail about the idea that when we have the bitterness, we need to also have something that will sweeten it, that we need to have something that will make it good. Actually, if I look real closely here, this is also talking about the reasons why we don't use roots or other things like horseradish. We then put them together in a korech, we wrap them together. This is what Hillel used to do as a reminder of the sacrifice. But of course, we are missing a piece of meat, and so it is kind of a mixed enjoyment of both putting them together, but also knowing that there is one thing missing from that combination. The Shulchan Orech is the actual meal. After that, we have the tzafun. This is when we eat the afikomen. Now, the afikomen is a reminder that in the ancient world, there were other cultures that would also have symposium dinners like this, where people would get together, where they would talk and share and study and eat. But in our communities, we made sure that when we finished, one, we were not so drunk that we couldn't stagger home, and two, that the final thing that we would eat would be the matzah, that we would go to bed with that flavor in our mouth as a reminder of the Exodus, and to make sure that we stayed on topic, that we were not overly distracted by the wonderful meal to have lost sight that this is a celebration of the emancipation from slavery. Many, many families have a custom of hiding the afikomen, and then the children will find it, often with a prize. Many also have a custom where the children will find it or kidnap it and then ransom it back to the family. Following this, like we would for any other meal, we have the Birkat HaMazon, Barech. There are special Passover editions, and this one we will also say over a cup of wine, which is still the tradition in many communities for any Birkat HaMazon, but not all. We then have Hallel, the rest of Hallel, which we add in many additional songs in order to enjoy and celebrate. And finally, we conclude with Nirtzah. Nirtzah is the formal conclusion, where we have our fourth cup of wine, but we also pour a fifth cup of wine. And this fifth cup of wine is meant to represent a fifth promise. You can remember about an hour ago, I led you through 4 different promises from Exodus 6. Well, if you go to the next verse, it says, I will bring you into the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you for a possession, I, the Lord. There is a debate, what we call a machloket, a dispute within the ancient texts of whether this fifth promise counts as being one of the promises over which a cup of wine should be lifted. Since we have not yet, at this point in the story, entered the land of Egypt, but we have enjoyed the deliverance, do we include this fifth promise as part of our celebration of Passover? For certainly Passover leads to its ultimate fulfillment. Or do we hold off on celebrating its ultimate fulfillment because Passover is purely about the promises that have been fulfilled on this night? And the answer is, we don't know. It's what's called a teku. We let it stand. So we pour the fifth cup, but we don't drink from the fifth cup. It is a compromised position. Instead, we say that when Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, arrives, he will answer our question for us and tell us whether we should drink that fifth cup as a fulfillment of this promise, or whether we should save that fulfillment of the promise and its celebration for a different night and not mix it with the celebration of Passover. The Seder will then usually go on for many, many more hours as people continue to sing, continue to talk, continue to share and study, and just really be a wonderful occasion for everyone together. Any questions? So, not including the eating, this class is a little shorter than what I would recommend for a good Seder. That if you want to make sure you have enough time to really sing, enough time to really talk, and enough time to really share with each other what Passover means, you're going to want to give yourself, in addition to the meal, more than an hour. But hopefully this at least gives you the framework so that as you approach and use the Haggadah and all the other wonderful resources online, you'll be able to enjoy that. I should let you know that I will be doing a special class for all of Temple Israel and anyone else who wants to join on doing the Seder this year. and providing more resources for people to do things on their own, since we will not be having a community Seder this year because of the virus. So keep your eyes open on our email, our WhatsApp, our Facebook, and all the other ways we try to communicate the different upcoming events and learning opportunities so that you can tune in for that, or at the very least, check out the recording. Any other questions for tonight? You've all been eerily quiet.
Oh.
Okay, then we are going to go ahead and finish up, and I will be hitting the stop streaming.